A shocking new report is accusing the New York Police Department of deliberately planning an attack on protesters in the Bronx. The Human Rights Watch reviewed hundreds of video clips and spoke to protesters from the June 4th demonstrations in Mott Haven. They concluded that police strategically waited until curfew to attack and arrest demonstrators who were protesting the death of George Floyd. The Mott Haven protest was the most violent clash between police and demonstrators in New York City this summer. And so, with me now is Ida Sawyer. She is the Acting Director of Crisis and Conflict for Human Rights Watch. We're really glad that you're here. So my first question to you, Ida, is what were the tactics used by officers to cause violence to the protesters, and how did the NYPD justify the tactics that were used?
So this protest in Mott Haven in the South Bronx began as a peaceful march through the neighborhood. Then, just at about 10 minutes before the 8 p.m. curfew, which had been imposed after looting in other parts of the city, scores of police officers surrounded and trapped the protesters using a tactic known as kettling. And the protesters were trapped. They then had no way to disperse. And just after 8 p.m., the police, unprovoked and without warning, they moved in on the protesters, wielding batons, beating people from car tops, shoving them to the ground, and firing pepper spray into their faces before rounding up more than 250 people for arrest. And the police, they essentially used this curfew as an excuse to assault, beat, and arrest these protesters. The NYPD told us that from 8 p.m. the protest was unlawful, and therefore non-essential workers out were breaking the law and could be arrested, but they did not account for the fact that the curfew order also called for people to be given an opportunity to disperse, and they clearly had no opportunity to do so in this case.
So what did you learn in speaking to some of the people who were there? What accounts did they give you and share with Human Rights Watch, and how did that become the legal basis for a case of human rights violations?
So people just described an incredibly chaotic, claustrophobic, scary scene as they realized all of a sudden they had nowhere to go. The police had surrounded them, and then they started seeing the police just beating down on them. People said they were, squeezed, pushed to the ground with people below them, people on top of them, and people had serious wounds. We documented at least 61 cases of protesters, legal observers, and bystanders who sustained injuries during the crackdown. This included lacerations, a broken nose, a lost tooth, sprained shoulder, broken finger, a lot of black eyes, and potential nerve damage due to overly tight zip ties. And most of the people injured did not receive any medical care, as the police arrested or obstructed volunteer medics who were wearing medical scrubs with Red Cross insignia. They were also targeted for arrest and obstructed for doing their work. So we found that dozens of people ended up spending hours in detention with untreated wounds and their hands bound behind their backs. So from all of this research, we found that the police tactics during this protest amounted to serious violations of international human rights law. And this includes the excessive use of force by law enforcement, violations of the right to free expression and peaceful assembly, arbitrary arrest and detention, and cruel and degrading treatment of the detainees. We also found that the legal observers and volunteers providing jail support, they are human rights defenders, and they're also protected under international human rights law and should never be targeted for this work. And lastly, the attacks on street medics, the obstruction of their work, and the denial of medical care to injured protesters amount to violations of the right to health.
So give us some context. People would have seen, protests happening all across New York City throughout the summer. Tell us about what this area is like.
So Mott Haven, it's a majority black and brown neighborhood in the South Bronx. It's one of the neighborhoods of the city that's really experienced the damaging consequences of systemic racism and the government's over-reliance on criminalization and policing to address societal problems for decades. And really many of the reasons people were out on the streets protesting. This neighborhood has some of the highest rates of poverty in the country, highest rates of homelessness in the city. It was also one of the neighborhoods hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've also found that Mott Haven has long been aggressively over-policed for low-level crimes, and more complaints about the use of physical force by police officers have been made in Mott Haven's 40th police precinct than in any of New York City's other 76 precincts. So many of the protesters we interviewed, they really felt that the police was targeting them because of where this protest was happening, the fact that it was in a majority Black and brown neighborhood, and because also the organizers are community activists from the South Bronx who are known for being very outspoken about police abuse and pressing for accountability.
Your report listed ways in which the NYPD can respond and move forward. What did you learn and what did you share with them about how they should be thinking about this, how they should be held accountable when this happens, and what the sort of standards should be following the release of this report?
Yeah, so we found that this operation was led by the Chief of Department of the NYPD, Terrence Monahan. He was present on the scene, overseeing this operation. And for us, the fact that he was there really emphasizes how the NYPD overall is modeling behavior that encourages and condones violence and abuse, and really that fuels impunity. So we have pressed Mayor de Blasio to take action immediately to show that there are consequences for the violence and abuse we documented in Mott Haven, and also for the mischaracterization of what happened, which we found from Police Department Commissioner Dermot Shea, who the day after the protest, he admitted that they had a plan that was nearly flawlessly executed in the Bronx, but he also spread misinformation that was debunked by other officials about allegations of violence and threats of violence by the protesters. So we've called for appropriate disciplinary action to be taken, including possible dismissal of both Commissioner Shea and Chief of Department Monahan. And if the mayor does not take appropriate action, we believe that he too should be held to account. But lastly, we found that this incident really reveals much deeper systemic problems of a police force that encourages violence, that fuels impunity, and that's modeled by top commanders. And really, we feel it shows the importance of the protesters' demands and the need for structural changes to reduce the role of police in addressing societal problems, including through significant decreases to the police force size and budget. And we feel the government should instead invest in real community needs, including through supports that support services for underlying issues such as homelessness and poverty, and that improve access to quality education and health care. And lastly, there's clearly a need to empower independent accountability systems to provide a genuine check on police misconduct.
So has the NYPD responded to your report?
So we wrote to the NYPD before we published our report with an overview of our findings and a list of specific questions. They replied in part to our questions. They sent us a letter. They claimed that the protest was unlawful starting at 8 p.m. because of the curfew, and therefore it was lawful to arrest people who were out who weren't essential workers. They did not address the fact that they trapped people and blocked them from dispersing before the curfew even went into effect, or all of the violence that was used against the protesters, which was, of course, entirely unjustified. They also claimed that the legal observers, at least 13 of whom were detained, in some cases violently, they claimed that they were not essential workers, which directly contradicted clarification that had been given by the mayor's office before the protest, saying that they were indeed essential workers. And then the police, in their response, they also repeated some of these unfounded allegations about the protest being an attempt by outside agitators to cause mayhem or tear down society and injured cops. And many of those allegations, we found very clearly in our research that there was no violence at all, no vandalism, no threats of violence on the part of the organizers or the protest during this June 4th protest in Mott Haven.
All right, Ida Sawyer from Human Rights Watch. Thank you, Ida, as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
CBS News independently reached out to the New York Police Department about the report. The NYPD spokesperson, Detective Denise Maroney, responded via email saying, quote, "We take strong exception to the subjective characterization of our police actions to maintain public order as a, quote, planned assault."